Welcome to Heresy, the Horus Heresy talk show. In this video, I'm going to be telling you all about the Imperial Fists units and rites of war in Horus Heresy, the Age of Darkness. We're going to talk about the characters and the units, what they do, how you can use them. We're going to talk about the rites of war and how they affect your army, and then we're going to summarize that and put it together into something easy to digest. If you've not seen part 1 to this video, I would highly recommend checking that out first. And in that video, I go into the special rules and the armory choices for Imperial Fists. Before we go any further, if you do enjoy the content, please do leave me a like and a subscribe on YouTube. It means a lot. And if you do have any feedback on the video or any comments you'd like to discuss anything that I'm talking about, please do leave me some comments below. And now, on with the show. First of all, the man himself, Rogal Dorn. So, Rogal Dorn has got probably one of the best defense abilities of the Primarch, so he can only be wounded on a 4+, that's what his armor gives him, which is really good. He's got a fairly standard Primarch stat line, other than having weapon skill 8, which is obviously really good. He's quite good at murdering lots of troops, because he's got Rampage on his sword, so he's got the ability to kill lots and lots of things in all at once. He's pretty good in a Primarch fight, like maybe 7 out of 10, maybe that's a bit generous, maybe a 6. He's hard to wound, which means most Primarchs will be wounding him on a 4 instead of probably a 2, as a lot of Primarchs would. And he does have weapon skill 8, which not every other Primarch has either. He's also got Shred on his chainsword, which means he's consistently wounding as well. What he doesn't have is any bonus to his attack, so he's just got your standard 6 Primarch attacks, and he doesn't have any bonuses to initiative either. So in the more dedicated Primarch v Primarch fights, he might lose out, but he's certainly not at the lower end. For his Warlord abilities, Army-wide Leadership 10 is amazing. Certainly up there with one of the best Primarch buffs. And also he does give +1 Army-wide to your combat results as well, which is pretty decent. He gives you a choice of reaction. So you can choose at the start of the battle what phase you want your extra reaction in, which is obviously fantastic because shooting and assault phase reactions are generally the best, but which is going to be the best dependent on your army composition and also on what you're playing against is going to change quite a lot. So being able to choose that is pretty awesome. So he's got really good army-wide buffs, all in all, I think. And also he deep strikes. So given the Imperial Fist ability to deep strike, lots of different things depending on what composition you're playing exactly, he can go with your troops, which is also good. Getting your Primarch into combat is one of the harder things for some Primarchs. It's not always that easy, particularly for just Primarchs on foot like Rogal Dorn is, so having this is really good. So all in all, I think they've got not one of the top Primarchs, but certainly one of the better army-wide buffs, and he is also quite good in combat as well, as all Primarchs are. So then we've got Sigismund, the original Crusader. So he is a combat monster. He lets you take Templar Brethren as troop choices, but not line, unfortunately. Now, the best thing that he does, other than just being great in combat, is he gives you 1 extra victory point for slaying the enemy warlord. Now, this, in a lot of missions, at least the book missions, is actually quite important. There are a lot of missions that are quite low scoring, so any way that gives you the ability to score extra victory points that doesn't need you to do anything in the mission can actually be quite clutch in a lot of games, and this is quite a big deal. As for Sigismund himself, he's got 2 of the best rules in the game. So Eternal Warrior, probably one of the most important things a character can do when fighting other characters is be immune to instant death in some way, whether that's extra toughness or having Eternal Warrior is great. And also he's fearless, which means the unit he joins also becomes fearless, which also just lets you ignore a lot of the more powerful things in the game, like pinning. He's got Mastercrafted on his weapon to go with his weapon skill 7. It causes instant death, so you can still instant death things with higher toughness, or he's good at, killing dreadnoughts. He strikes at initiative, not last. And most importantly, he makes the enemy re-roll invulnerable saves when he's in a challenge. So that rule in particular, along with everything else he does, puts him at probably being the top duelist out of most characters in the game, if not all characters in the game aside from Primarchs. Most fights between 2 characters will just be a little bit of luck as to who fails their invulnerable saves first, especially when they cause instant death to each other. Sigismund can't be instant death, which means most people are going to have to hit him multiple times to kill him, get through his save, whereas he's making them re-roll their save. So he's going to beat most people in a combat with no issue. And if he does fight a Primarch, although he's probably going to lose against most Primarchs, he's got a good chance of getting some damage through, which most characters don't because of this reroll and vulnerable saves. And with a bit of luck, he could kill a Primarch as well. +1 army-wide combat results for his Warlord trait can be a bit mediocre for Fists. The same on Rogal Dorn. It's not really why you take him. But in some builds, it can also be really good. So it's a bit up and down as to whether that one's good. He brings a movement phase reaction, though, unfortunately. Like, more reactions are always good, but movement phase are definitely the weaker of the reactions. But, you know, if you want to bring a character that's just going to mince every opposing character on the battlefield, Sigismund is a great choice. Then we've got Alexis Polux, so the original Crimson Fist. So he brings some interesting rules. He makes his unit immune to pins. He can deep strike as well. He's a master tactician, so he can redeploy a unit at the start of the game, is his Warlord trait. So he lets you take a unit off the table and put it into reserve. So when he deep strikes, he can bring a unit with him as well. So you can take a unit off and put it into reserve, or you can take a deep striking unit and put it on the battlefield, which is kind of good in theory. And, you know, it's always nice to be able to do those kind of things, but I'm not sure it's super incredible, particularly with there being so many augury scanners around, you know, deep striking like a single unit, doing a bit of redeploy tricks. A lot of opponents just kind of won't care. What it is good for is putting your unit on the table, and then depending on how your opponent sets up, picking it up and putting it into deep strike if you can see maybe a safe place to put the unit, like out of augury scanner, line of sight. Maybe there's somewhere where your opponent sets up which gives you an opening to drop that deep strike unit in. And if that doesn't happen, you've got them on the table, so they're not getting deep striking and getting shot by augury scanners. So that is kind of a cool thing to do. Other than that, though, he's really just a slightly more expensive Praetor, which is, you know, fine. He's slightly more expensive. He gives you a interesting rule, and if you're into the character as well, he's good to play. He does have this one single big Power Fist punch attack, which is ultimately a little bit underwhelming. Because, yeah, sure, if you just want to punch something and instant death it, that's good and all. Or if you just want to punch a vehicle and try to take it out, that's good. But a Solar Rite Power Gauntlet with multiple attacks can do that to a vehicle anyway. And against most enemies, you would rather hit them multiple times, because most big things have got an invulnerable save, and you don't just want to hit them once and have them save it. So it's a flavour rule more than anything else. But Alexis Polux, pretty good alternate choice for a Praetor. That gives you a little few extra special rules. Okay, Fafnir Rann. So he is another great character. So he gives you Defensive Hammer of Wrath on the unit that he's in. So D3 plus 3 Strength 5 Hammer of Wrath attacks when you charge his unit, which is kind of cool. When you fight him in combat, you get -1 strength when he's using a single axe as well. So again, puts him out of instant death range against a lot of common weapons like Power Fists and Thunder Hammers when they would be strength 8. So that's a really good ability. Anything that makes your characters not get instant death normally makes them very good against other characters. Just makes a world of difference. Phalanx Warders in his army for his Warlord trait get +1 weapon skill when they charge. So we'll come on to them in a minute, but normally they only get +1 weapon skill when they get charged. So he makes them a bit more offensive and makes them a bit more defensive with his Defensive Hammer of Wrath, which is a cool thing. You know, he buffs both of the things that they do. Ultimately, he goes really well with Warder units, but he also goes really well in a Warder unit himself, because Warder units buff the characters that are in them too. And, you know, him and other characters as well, but also him also really benefit from that. So he's a good character. He's not too expensive for what he does. He's great in a duel, and he has some great buffs for Phalanx Warders in your army, and as we'll talk about in a minute, they're a really good unit, which makes him a really good character. Onto the units now. So first we got the Templar Brethren. Now, everyone loves Templar Brethren. They look cool. Their colour scheme's great. They are, you know, very evocative of Templars in the real world as well. Everyone likes them. Their weapon skill 5, which is great. The thing that really holds them back from being good is that they just get power swords. So no special Legion weapon, no access to any cool stuff. They get Furious Charge, so they're +1 strength on the charge, but ultimately they're just guys with power swords. And that's a bit of a problem for them, because most Legion's elite combat units like this have access to something that makes them more killy in combat. So you look at Invictus Suzerains, for example, which are a little bit more expensive than these, but they get 3 attacks each, and they get those striking at initiative AP2 power axes, and they get a board and shield as well. These guys don't get an invulnerable save of note, and I think it really makes them struggle. You know, they're a 2+ save unit, but armed only with power swords. It's kind of tough to make them work. Now, that doesn't mean that they are so awful I wouldn't take them, particularly if you really like Templars. But you got to be aware of the limitations. You know, they're good at chopping up Space Marines. They're not really so good at chopping up anything with a 2+ save. Crusader is a great rule, and it really does mean that, you know, just 5 of these guys will win a combat against, you know, like 20 tactical Marines. They'll win that combat handily, and then they can sweep them off the board with higher chances with Crusader, and that's what this unit is potentially good at. Just 5 guys being able to take out bigger units by utilising that Crusader rule. Just try to avoid getting them into combat with cheaper units. They obviously can take a mastercrafted Solarite Gauntlet or Thunderhammer on the leader, which does pump up their ability to kill tougher stuff if you want to, but is also kind of expensive. But what I would do, especially since they're on the models anyway, but I would do it anyway, is put combat shields on them all, so at least they've got some save against people wanting to shoot them with big guns, or if they do end up in combat with people with power fists and that kind of stuff. The combat shields are only 2 points, so a very worthy investment. And the Vexillor as well. Again, one of the models has got one, so that's good, but also you don't get to use your Crusader unless you win, so make sure that you win in those combats with them. They're not the best unit in the world, for sure, but if you are going to take them, make sure you kit them out to do what they do well, which is win combats and sweep enemy units off the board without having to invest lots of points into making the unit big and, you know, worry about having to kill lots of enemy models. Really lean on working that Crusader rule. And last but by no means least, we've got Phalanx Warders. Much discussed unit on the internet. Lots of cries of these guys being overpowered, lots of different stuff. So let's take a look at why that is. Well, they're a breacher unit, effectively. They get +1 weapon skill when they get charged. So they got 5 WS when you charge them, but they do only have 1 attack. So effectively that weapon skill is mostly meaning that they are harder for you to hit when you charge them, plays into their defensive abilities. They also get +1 to their invulnerable saves when they're in base-to-base with 2 of the models from the unit, and when they're not fallen back or pinned, which also makes them tougher as well, gives them a 4+ invulnerable save, effectively. But it does force you into certain formations, so if you deploy them in a line, the models on the ends of the line won't have that save, which means that, you know, anyone who's able to precision strike the unit in any way can just, you know, target the ones that are a little bit easier to kill. Or you can deploy them in like a 2x5 formation, so, you know, 2 rows of 5, which does mean that more models are going to get it, and that does also compress your unit though, which means that people shooting them with things like blasts will get a lot more hits. You are going to get your reroll for being heavy when people shoot you with blasts to counter that though as well, so, you know, there's some choices to make there. If you also do deploy them in a formation that's not like a little box, enemy snipers can pick off individual models to break that base-to-base contact as well. So there's a few different ways to deny the invulnerable saves if your opponent's got those things. But the main reason you would lose that is if you get pinned. And these guys have got nothing special regards leadership. They've got no stubborn or anything like that. So they can be pinned, and they will lose that bonus if that happens. One thing worth noting here, though, is that both of those bonuses apply to characters in the unit, which is a really, really big deal. You know, giving +1 weapon skill to a character is massive, because what it will mean is when that character fights in a challenge, he's probably going to be 1-up versus other characters in the challenge. So if you've got a guy in the unit with weapon skill 6, he's going to be 7. If you got someone like Sigismund in the unit, he's going to go up to 8, which is Primarch level weapon skill, and that's a kind of a nuts bonus. Also, +1 to invulnerable saves as well can push your characters into the 3+ save range. So any Praetors with an Iron Halo will have a 3+ invulnerable save, which is also a really big deal. Now, personally, I think those things shouldn't apply to characters in the unit. I think that's just a little bit over the top, probably unnecessary for the unit to have that rule. But we are where we are. It's very good. These guys really love having a character with them to benefit from those bonuses. Equipment-wise, they can take a Termite, which is, you know, common to all breachers, but which is good for getting these guys to the battle. They do have power axes, which is good, but they do only have one attack, remember? So they're not great at killing things, particularly if they get charged, which is sort of where they want to be to get their +1 weapon skill. They also have a plasma gun option, which is kind of unusual for breacher-type troops. Now, one of the things I like with breacher-type troops is giving your opponent a reason to come and get them. And a couple of plasma guns in the unit, whilst not as effective as mass plasma guns, it's on a much tougher unit, a much tougher to remove unit than something like a tactical support squad. So a couple of plasma guns in the unit is not super expensive, is relevant firepower for shooting at enemy high toughness stuff, and will make these a bit of a ranged threat that your opponent's going to want to come to. I would advise upgrading the Sergeant's melee weapon most of the time. In my experience with breachers, the problems with them are either losing combat and getting swept, and these guys have nothing special for winning combat, or just not being able to kill enough things, which these guys do have power axes but only one attack. Giving the Sergeant a Solarite Power Gauntlet or a Thunder Hammer, when he's already got 2 base attacks, just gives them that ability to do a few extra wounds and win the combats, or at least lose them by less, potentially. And for that reason, the Vexillor is also a good option on these guys, and the kit does come with a model with a Vexillor as well. Bear in mind, though, that all of these costs can add up, and the unit is 225 points, which is very expensive for 1 wound models, even when they've got the extra save that these guys have got. Even if you put an apothecary in the unit, that kind of stuff, they can get expensive. And overall, this unit is probably not super incredibly powerful on its own outside the Rites of War, just because it's really pricey. But, obviously the Rites of War do change that. Luckily for Phalanx Warders, a Rite of War exists called the Stone Gauntlet, which you might have heard about a little bit. So this does a lot for Warders. It makes them troops, it makes them line, importantly, and it also gives them Heart of the Legion as well. So it makes them a scoring unit, thus forcing your opponent to have to deal with this super tough unit, and it improves their survivability. It also improves their survivability notably by letting them re-roll their invulnerable save, which is huge. Mathematically, re-rolling a 4+ invulnerable save, which is what they'll have most of the time, is somewhere between a 2+ and a 3+ in terms of chance of success. And that makes these guys very, very tanky, and means that you can't use anything with AP to get through them. There are a couple of things to note. They get this when they're in coherency with 2 of the models, not base to base, unlike the Phalanx Warder rules, which is kind of weird. So I'm assuming that might change at some point, or maybe it'll stay the same, but you can't really break this. You can't really get rid of this invulnerable save because they just need to be in coherency. They do lose it when they run or charge, so they're a bit slower at maybe getting to the objectives than some units would be, because you're not going to want to run them up the battlefield and lose this, because your opponent will turn all their guns on them. And you also lose it when you're charging as well, which is a real disadvantage, because you definitely aren't going to want to charge these guys into combat. And if the opponent gets to the objectives before you, which they may well do, particularly given that these guys can't run, these guys pushing opponent stuff off the objective is going to lose them that invulnerable save. And if the opponent's unit is good in combat that you're charging, you're probably going to have a bad time charging them. You also lose it when you sweep, although you only lose it for your own turn, so that's kind of irrelevant most of the time. It also gives them Hammer of Wrath 1, as if this didn't give them enough rules already. The limitations of the Stone Gauntlet, though, are that you can't deep strike anything, which we're fine with, because deep striking is for other kind of Imperial Fist armies, and it limits your elites and your fast attack choices to a total of the number of troops you've got in your army. Now that is some level of limitation, because elites is a great and powerful slot, and being limited in the total number between those two, to maybe 3 if you got 3 troops in your Stone Gauntlet, does mean that you're going to be effectively losing an elite slot and all your fast attack slots. But you can definitely build around this, particularly since Imperial Fists love their heavy support slots so much for extra line troops with the Castellan and that kind of stuff. So this isn't really a very big limitation. So some other things to note about the Stone Gauntlet. Apothecaries are obviously very good. When you've got units that have already got an invulnerable save, giving them a feel no pain to take afterwards as well, that will be boosted to a 4+ by Heart of the Legion if they're on an objective, can make them just insanely tanky. This Rite of War's got very little drawbacks to your army composition, as we've just mentioned, really. So taking them Phalanx Warders, giving them Apothecaries, is just a very powerful thing to do. There are ways for your opponent to disrupt the toughness, as we've said about snipers, pinning. The unit doesn't have any leadership bonuses particularly either, so, if it does lose combat, it probably is going to run away. And when you build the army with the Stone Gauntlet, you do need to mitigate those weaknesses. So, good examples of this are putting a character with high leadership in the unit, which is beneficial anyway, because Phalanx Warders buff their characters, whether that's a special character like Fafnir Rann or Sigismund, or just a Praetor or a Centurion. Maybe a Herald to make them fearless as well. Kitted out for combat would be a good thing. And also as well, being able to shoot or disrupt your opponent's units. If your opponent has got things that can pin these, you are going to want to focus on getting rid of those things off the battlefield so that your Phalanx Warders are harder for your opponent to counter. And all in all, these do become very powerful units using this. But without using this Rite of War, Phalanx Warders are actually not great. So, although this is a super powerful Rite of War and potentially not a great play experience for an opponent, you would be forgiven for wanting to use this Rite of War because Phalanx Warders aren't very good without it. So I think the important thing with this is to consider how you use it without making it a bad experience for your opponent as well. So you should consider maybe not spamming Phalanx Warders, so maybe 2 units of them to make them really good in the list is a good thing, but don't spam 4 potentially. Also consider not making Death Stars. It would be very easy for you to accidentally make a Death Star with these units, so a good unit of these, maybe 10, maybe more, with a character like Fafnir Rann and an Apothecary, just becomes sort of good at everything and very hard to shift, especially if you're giving them some backup from the shooting units in your army as well. Consider maybe not doing that. Consider maybe leaving the Apothecaries out to not make them too overly powerful. Consider not maybe putting special characters in every unit, maybe just in one. You can use this, but use it responsibly so your opponent doesn't feel like you've got a unit they just can't hurt. Strong opponents, though, or strong and well put together armies, I don't think should have a real issue with this Rite of War. You can snipe Apothecaries out of units. You can pin these guys with Librarian with telepathy, or you can just pin them by making them take lots of pinning checks, even if they have got a, maybe a Leadership 9 character, maybe not against a Leadership 10 one, but you can pin them. You can also just hurt them with mass fire, so things like Volkite Culverins, or even just Bolters from mass tactical units are all things that these guys can be killed by. So I don't think the Stone Gauntlet is really that much of a problem at a more sort of serious technical level of play. But if that's not the level you're playing at, if that's not the level your opponent is playing at particularly, you really should consider using this Rite of War a bit responsibly, because it is a little bit much when you put all the synergies together at once. Then on a lighter note, we've got the Hammerfall Strike Force. So this makes your Phalanx Warders, I should say, troops, not line though. So that's a kind of here nor there, because maybe that unit's not so great. All infantry in the army or in the Rite of War at least can deep strike for 30 points, and they get shrouded 5+ on arrival, which is great. That's exactly the kind of rule that deep striking armies need to not get completely taken apart by augury scanners when you deep strike. That's quite a cool thing. You don't have to use Phalanx Warders in the army. This could just be a normal Imperial Fists army where you're gonna deep strike a bunch of units. Whatever units those are, tactical squads, like any of that kind of stuff. This is a cool thing to add to them. Vehicles have got to go in reserves, so that's okay. We don't mind that. You could just make the army with no vehicles to get around that limitation. No fortifications. Okay, that makes the average Imperial Fists commander cry, but equally from a game point of view, easy something you could do without. Good, fun, and thematic Rite of War that would make your army a little bit more interesting, give Deep Strike to some interesting units, and buff them when they turn up. I think this is great Rite of War. You could definitely build some interesting armies around it that would also be effective on the tabletop. And then we've got Templar Assault as well. So Templar Assault makes Templar Brethren troops and line and gives them Heart of the Legion. Now that's really suddenly makes that unit actually pretty decent. They're still not going to go and chop up enemy Terminators because of their power sword issues, but they do get Rage 2 when they disembark from something. So if you put them in a Land Raider, you go and charge them forward, they go and charge an enemy, they got 4 attacks each, still with power swords, but they have got 4 attacks each, and now they're line, and they've got a little bit of extra survivability from Heart of the Legion as well. Drawbacks, you've got to use them as your compulsory troops. Well, you were probably going to anyway if you took this Rite of War. Loyalist only, fine. Same limitation as the Stone Gauntlet around elites and fast attack. So that is a real limitation, although if you're going to be taking a bunch of Templars in Land Raiders to make use of that Rage 2, you're going to spend a lot of your points on that anyway, so maybe elite and fast attack limitation is not much of a big deal. Not a super powerful Rite of War, but low limitations and does make them Templar Brethren a little bit better, give them a little bit more of a reason to exist. And having a bunch of Templars taking objectives with line is cool and definitely feels a bit more Templar-y. So if you were going to want to run those models, I would definitely run them in this to make best use of them. So in summary, for the Imperial Fist in this part of the book, they have a great character selection. They do. They have got lots of characters that are very good at what they do. They've probably got the best duelist in the game. They've got Fafnir Rann that buffs one of their best units. They do have weak unit options though, at least outside of the Rites of War. So Templar Brethren are not super exciting, and Phalanx Warders are also not very good outside of the Rite of War. Stone Gauntlet is borderline overpowered. It is fair to say that, outside of a more serious environment at least, which is certainly not your default environment for playing Horus Heresy. So do make good decisions around when you're using that. Really make sure you're not just giving your opponent bad games by stacking up too many of them synergies. Ultimately, I think the Imperial Fist unit section is quite limited in the diversity it brings for general army building. It doesn't give you a bunch of units that you want to pick up and put into your general armies, maybe using different Rites of War or using a mix of troops, that kind of stuff. Most of the options and the diversity in Imperial Fist actually comes from their armory section. So being able to deep strike the Terminators, being able to take them special storm shields, assault cannons, the Castellan. The interesting bits of building Imperial Fist armies really comes from the unit options rather than these units themselves. But overall, I think Imperial Fist's done pretty well out of their book and with what they can bring to the table. And I think fair to say, if you are an Imperial Fist player, pretty exciting addition of the game, pretty exciting set of rules to play around with and build lots of different armies. That's it for this video. I hope you enjoyed all the information in this. If you did enjoy it, please do leave me a like and a subscribe on YouTube. And if you've got any comments or feedback at all, please drop them in the comments section below. Thanks very much for listening, and I'll see you soon. Bye-bye.